Hi all, I welcome you to Microsoft Azure Pakistan Community August 2022 second meetup. And there are a few housekeeping rules that I would like to tell before we move on with today's session. We plan to meet up online at least once a month on Saturdays. The online meetings will be organized using Microsoft Teams. The online meetings will be recorded and later uploaded to Microsoft Azure Pakistan Community YouTube channel so that those people who were not able to attend for some reasons can go there and watch those recordings. I would request you to please mute yourself during the meeting. The meetup time would be around 1 hour to 1 hour and 30 minutes depending upon the time that is needed by the speaker. And there would be 10-15 minutes for the Q&A session in the end. And I would request you all to please write your questions in the chat section. Microsoft Azure Pakistan community is present on LinkedIn, YouTube, and Twitter, and these are the different social media handles for Microsoft Azure Pakistan community. We are a part of Azure Tech Group, so we follow a code of conduct. And our code of conduct is that we should be friendly and welcoming, be patient, be thoughtful in how you communicate in person and online, and be respectful and inclusive, and be open and curious, and reach out to the organizers if you need anything. Microsoft Azure Pakistan community is now a part of Azure Tech Groups, which is a bigger community of local user groups that are officially associated with Microsoft. And these Azure Tech Groups are present in around 45 countries across the world. And there are in total 148 Azure Tech Groups as of now, with a total member count of above 200,000. And today we'll be discussing around governing Azure resources. And today's session will provide knowledge over governing Azure resources that will include management growth, RBAC, policy tags, subscriptions, and blueprints. And today we have the honor of having Mr. Azhar Khuwaja. Azhar Khuwaja is a telecom and IT trainer with over 20 years of experience in training, and his area of expertise are network security, software-defined networking, and Azure. And he has 14 certifications Azure certifications along with NCT, and he teaches various Azure courses from Microsoft training partners globally, along with his part-time consultancy assignments. So thank you very much, Azhar Saab, for providing us your precious time today. And please go ahead with sharing your presentation and moving with your presentation.
All right, so thank you very much, Akbar Saab. It's really an honor for me to be here and speaking at Microsoft Azure Pakistan community. It's really they're doing a great service, and I just attended it a few weeks, I think few months back, and then I realized that I also need to contribute. So it's really an honor for me to be here, and thank you very much for inviting me to be speaking here. So let's talk about the governing Azure resources. So this is what I'm planning for today. So what exactly are we going to cover in this governing Azure resources? So, we all have experience of working in on-premises in our enterprise organizations for many, many years. The cloud is relatively new for us. So we all know that in our on-premises, in our organizations, we do have some policies, procedures, recommendations, the guidelines, the procedures we need to follow, and they come from the top management. So the top management, because they are aware of the challenges we going to face, or they make these strategies and they have a long-term vision. So they come up with these policies, procedures, guidelines, and then the authorization, who should be doing what, who should be, the in charge of what. And they also deal with the budgeting, how much a particular department, business unit, the project should have the budget, and how much they, and so they also come. So basically, how do you run an organization comes under the governance, and most of these governance policies, procedures, they come from the top management. So we already familiar with these things in an on-premises environment, like in in your organizations, in your. Now the question is that if you have migrated to Azure, and Azure, as you know, is a Microsoft's cloud platform, so how do you govern your resources in Azure? Is it the same like you've been doing in the on-premises, or is it a little different ones? So this is what we're going to discuss, that how do you govern Azure resources and in Azure. So the resources can be a virtual machine, can be a application, can be a database, can be any other resource, let's say the app, database, virtual machines, and these different these resources you're looking at. So today we're going to focus on what are the ways we can govern our resources in Azure. We can't buy resources in Azure. We can only rent it in Azure. So how do we govern and how do we manage those? So a little bit introduction of myself, but I think Akbar Saab has already kindly introduced me, so I will skip that and I'll come to these straight. So the points I'm going to talk about in governing Azure resources are management groups, subscriptions, resource groups, RBAC related to the permissions, tags like labels, logs, policy, initiative, blueprint. So these are the things when we discuss the governance. They actually these they actually help us in managing what we're trying to do, what policies we want to enforce, what are the things we need to keep in a way. Let's say we have a budget restrictions, we have the authorization restrictions, we do have like how do we keep our resources and things like this. So these are the things you may have seen some of the you may have experienced some of these things. They all help us in the governing Azure resources. Now, first of all, when we're talking about the governance in the public cloud, and Azure is an example of a public cloud where anyone can, acquire resources, they can migrate their resources, they can deploy their resources, and configure their resources. So the governance here actually provides us mechanisms and processes to maintain and control our application resources in Azure. Resources again can be virtual machine, can be database, can be any particular app, or any other resource we're looking at. And also it looks into the requirements planning and initiative, setting strategic priorities. So for example, your organization knows the long-term the strategy, what their business targets are, and what they're trying to achieve. So based on this, they make policies and we enforce those to achieve that one. So there are 4 things we need to understand when we talk about the governance in Azure or in any public cloud, but here we especially targeting Azure. The first thing is the management groups. The second is the subscription, resource group, and resources. This is a hierarchy we always keep in our we always use for governing our resources in Azure. Now, if we look at here, the management groups, this is the first thing. Now, remember, by default, when you get a subscription, you already have a root management group. And that root management group or tenant root group is just like, in the Linux file system, you have a root directory at the top, which you cannot remove. It's always there by default. So same is the case here. If we look into this diagram, we have a tenant root group. It's always going to be there. Now you can't do anything about it. That is going to be there. But under it, you can create as many management groups as you like. And why do you want to create those management groups? to manage your resources. So these management groups can be your business units, can be your departments. So every organization has its own hierarchy. Like for example, in my organization, there may be 3 main departments, and under it, there may be 3 sub-departments under those departments, or, so you need to um, find out, your, let's say from the top management or whatever, they are the ones who decide how the hierarchy is going to be, and then, how many levels of hierarchy, how many management. So based on this, you can create those management groups. So these management groups reflect the business units or departments in your organization. And then you assign subscriptions under those management groups. And by keeping subscription under those management group, you can enforce these subscription under some policies, some budget restrictions, and so this is how you can do that. And then we know that the resource groups always associated with the subscription. So whenever you create a resource group, you need to define a subscription. And the resource group, again, you can create as many resource groups you want, depending on, some organizations have resource groups based on the type of resources. Some organizations have resources based on the geographical location. Some organizations have resources based on the departments, based on the business units, based on some different factors. So they can, or and so you can decide how many and resource groups you want to have, and what is the policy behind it, on what basis you want to create those resource groups. You can also create just one resource group and have everything under it, but that's not a good design. So you may want to have some sort of a policy to do that. And then, of course, in the resource group, you can have resources. So these, and the resources, as we know, can be a database, can be virtual machine, can be an application. So these can be a SQL server, can be the different things. You can have these resources. So these are the main 4 levels that define a typical Azure hierarchy. And through these 4 levels, management group, subscription, resource group, and resources, you can govern and manage resources in your organization, and you can enforce policies, procedures, guidelines, whatever your authorization restrictions you have, you can mention it. So again, as I said, if I go quickly to the management groups are for management purposes, and you can define a scope. So under management groups, you can have subscription. As I said, management group can be just a business unit or a department, HR, marketing, sales. These can be your departments in your Azure hierarchy. Remember, I'm talking about Azure. So we're talking about the Microsoft's cloud platform. So you can create those as many as you like, depending on, there can be 6 levels of the, you can have maximum 6 levels of management groups, and you can, under one management group, you can have as many children of the management group as you want. But remember that the management group can only have one parent, not more than that. So that's the basic rule of the management groups, and it's pretty straightforward to create it. If I can just show you let me share my screen. So if I can go to the portal, and it's pretty easy to deal with the management groups. And when we go to the management groups, if you can see, right now I got a tenant root group. This is what I was talking about. In the tenant root group, that is by default you're going to have it. And then I got 2 subscriptions under this tenant root group. Now you can easily create a management group, just like, for example, I want to create a HR management group, and I want to submit it, and then, so it's just a simple procedure. These are not the groups which you create in Azure Active Directory, so do not mix it up with that one. The groups you create in Azure Active Directory, those are functional, those are the groups where you can have users and these. But in here, these are the management groups where you can assign subscription policies, define scope. And so we just created the HR group. You can see it's in here. And if you want to bring a subscription under it, you can easily do so. So you can just, bring my subscription under this HR group. And in this way, this subscription now will be under the HR group. If I click on this, you can see now this subscription is now under the scope of the HR group. So this way, you can create, these management groups. So let me bring so we're back into the slides. We talked about the management groups. The next thing is the subscription. Subscription is also part of that hierarchy we mentioned, like 4 levels of hierarchy. Subscription is simply how do you pay for your resources? You can't purchase any resources in Microsoft Azure. You can only rent it. And so there are different types of subscriptions. There are enterprise subscriptions. There are, partner subscriptions. There are student subscriptions. There are free subscription, trial subscriptions you can try. So there are different types of subscription. If you are a big organization like an enterprise, you will be looking at enterprise level subscriptions, which come with the long-term commitment, which have less restrictions. And having a less restriction, you can get a lot of discounts, because if you make a long, let's say you're buying a virtual machine and you make a 3 years commitment, you get like a more than 50% discount from Microsoft for buying this. But then there are also pay-as-you-go like subscription, which are like a metered services, and then there are also, as I said, for learning purposes like trial subscription, student subscription, and there are different types of other subscriptions. So in your organizations, you may have one subscription, you have multiple subscriptions. We advise that when you have more than, a bigger organization or even a medium-sized organization, you should have multiple subscriptions so that you can, have separate budgets. You can, keep it under different management groups. And in this way, you can control the the spending, and you can keep an eye on how much you are spending, and that's very. So if we see in this diagram here, we got a tenant root, okay, and under the tenant root group we got a XYZ, which is your organization. Let's say xyz.com is your organization. So you got a management group you created under tenant root group, and you have a subscription associated. This yellow key is the symbol of the subscription. Similarly, under XYZ, I got 2 management groups. Now, again, under the marketing, I got 2 subscription. Under technical, I got 1 subscription, which is R&D. And then again, under production management group, I got 3 subscriptions under production, which are A, B, and C, F, A, F, B, F, C. So having different subscriptions under different management groups can help you segregate your spending, budgeting, and so it is kind of easier to manage and deal with the spendings, you doing it on department-wise or on the business units type. So depending on your organization, you can have multiple subscription, which is very common in mid-size or a large-size organization, having multiple subscriptions. Then we're going to talk about the resource groups. And resource group is like a, logical container where you keep resources. Your resource group can be in one location. Your resources group could be in different locations. So for example, you create a resource group in East US region. Your resources can be in West US, UK South, South Australia region. So it's not compulsory that all resources should be in the same region as the resource group belongs. And resource groups come under the subscription. And you can create as many resource groups you want. Resource group do not physically hold the resources. It's just some metadata. It's like association, and so you associate your resources with the resource group. When you delete a resource group, everything inside will be deleted, like all the resources associated with that resource group can be deleted. So you can move resources from one resource group to the other, from, they may be in different subscriptions, they may be in different geographical locations. That is not an issue. So how many resource groups you're going to have, it depends. Again, you need to look at your organization and you can decide. Normally, you should have a policy. So we want to create resource groups based on geographical location because we got presence in different locations, or we want to create resource group based on the type of resources, like separate for compute resources, separate for containers, separate for databases, separate for application. You can do that way also. You can also create resource groups based on the, as I said, department-wise, project-wise, the business unit type-wise. So you can do, but it's always a good thing if you can name it in such a way that you can, by looking at the resource group name, you can also right away recognize what resource group is it and what's the purpose of this one. And you can also apply permissions to the resource groups, like RBAC, role-based access control. You can apply policies to the resource groups. You can apply logs, labels, tags to the resource group. And if you apply at the resource group level, all the resources in that resource group will inherit those things which you applied at the resource group. Just like if you apply at the subscription level, it will be inherited by all the resource groups which come under that subscription. So that is another level in that. And then of course the fourth one is resources itself. Now we're going to look at the RBAC, which is also very important in the governance. And RBAC is about the authorization. And so, it says role-based access control, and Microsoft uses a role-based strategy. Like in other industries, you may have heard mandatory access control, rule-based access control, discretionary access control, but Microsoft uses role-based access control. Access control means the authorization for what resources you have authorization to access or use. And so based on your role in your organization, you have the authorization. And so who decides it comes from the top management. And that's why it is also part of the governance, that who should be doing what. For example, I don't have access to all the resources, in my organization, even though I'm, an employee. So in the same way, some people have owner role, some people have contributor role, some people have the, the reader role, and so there are different roles in there. And if we want to take a look at it, give me a second. So if I can go back into here and sorry, let me share my screen. Is there a question here, or I can answer it then? What's the question?
The question is, it's related to that whether the recording of this YouTube, of this recording of this session would be available on YouTube or not. So the recording would be available on YouTube.
Excellent. So coming back in here, we can see, we're talking about the RBAC, and we can go to the resource groups. And let's say I got these 3 resource groups, for example, And you're gonna find here option access control IAM and identity access management. And over here, you can define what roles you already have. You can take a look. It's about the authorization. And so you can see right now I got two roles already, the owner and user access administrator. If you want, you can add another role and you can define what role you want to have, and you can assign it to either a user group or service principal, and you can just go further, and you can decide, select the user. So for example, I want to select myself, and then you can assign. So RBAC is basically based on the roles, um, based on the roles your role in your organization. So they give you the authorization. What you can also do it at the resource level. And let's say if I pick a resource, for example this one, you can also assign the authorization based at the resource level, at the resource group level, or at the subscription level. So they're pretty helpful. And so we want to assign people only what they're supposed to do. And that is part of the governance also, who should be doing what and who should have the authorization of what they can do. So if I go back into the let me share my screen. So I'm back to the slide, and we were talking about the RBAC, which is also part of that. And in the RBAC, remember, don't mix the RBAC roles with the Azure Active Directory roles. Azure Active Directory roles are the management roles, and they are their scope is always the tenant level. And so that can be like a global administrator, or these are typical Azure Active Directory roles. And these are, if you want to migrate, or you want to assign users, create users permissions, you need those roles. But here RBAC roles are functional roles, depending on which resource group is specific, maybe a storage account, maybe as the database, virtual machine, application, whatever resource specific to that resource. You can define what the user can do, what the user cannot do. So you can see the permission. When you go to those roles, you can see there is a JSON template, and the JSON templates defines what are the permissions and what are the things you cannot do in this role. And JSON, as you know, is not a programming language. JSON is JavaScript object notation. It's a data exchange format. And so you can humanly readable. If you focus on it, you will be able to understand what it's talking about. It's always like the name value pair, or key value, like the location, East US, username, Azhar, password 123. It's always something like this. So it's humanly readable. So, and if you don't like a role, like let's say if you think the roles which are built into the portal, they don't serve your purpose, you can always define your custom role, and you can upload it. So if in your organization, the management wants to have a role which you can't find it in the portal, the built-in role in Microsoft Azure portal, you can always make your own JSON template, and you can use that one. Then there's another thing which helps us in governance is the tags. And so you apply tags to the resources, you apply tag to the resource groups, you apply tag to the individual resources, virtual machine, applications, databases, containers, compute services, SQL Server, whatever you have resources. So why do you want to have tags? Tags are going to help you in identifying your resources. They always have just like a JSON template, you always have a name value pair, and the name value pair is always like you can say department, marketing, cost center, manage project management. So in this way, you can always define tags, and the tags can also be referred in the scripts if you want to. And also, if you apply tags to the resources or resource group, you can always you know, if you want to find out how much you've been spending, and let's say you got a, a project, and you want to find out the costs associated with that project, and that project is spread across different teams in your organization. So there is like a marketing involved, R&D involved, IT involved, and so you can't have these separate like a budgeting based on, or the cost based on a specific subscription. So you can assign tags, and based on the tags, you can also find out how much that project is, costing you in terms of resources. Even that project resources are spread in different subscriptions, in different resource groups, and in different management groups. It doesn't matter. You can. So it's also a very handy way to find out the the cost associated with your resources for a particular project or assignment, and then of course tags can also be referred in the Python or the PowerShell scripts. Another thing associated here is the logs. Logs are also very useful in the governance. Like if you want to apply logs to the resources so that people or the users cannot accidentally delete resources or modify resources, you can do so. And if you go to the portal and you go to that particular resource or the resource group, there is an option on the left hand side which says logs. And in the logs, basically there are two types of logs: read-only logs, and there's also another one which is called the delete logs. And so read-only, as the name suggests, you can only read, you can't do anything about it. Delete logs, you can modify it, but you can't delete it. And so these are sort of a protection that the users cannot accidentally delete resources, and so they put the logs in there. So you can apply those logs at subscription level, at the resource group level, and also at the resource level. So depending on where. Now the main thing is here is the policy and initiative. See, in your on-premises environment where you work most of in your life, there are always policies. For example, BYOD policy, bring your own device policy, guest user access to your company network policy, policy about use of corporate devices for personal use, that is policy. So you already know a lot of policies in your on-premises environment. Now the question is that you have migrated to Azure, and now your resources are deployed in Azure. So can you have policies in Azure also? Yes, you can. So what can be the typical Azure policy? If I can give the example, a typical policy, I can give you an example. Let's say we only want to buy resources from UK South region. That can be a policy, and you need to be in compliance with. Maybe another policy example I can give you, you only need to buy a certain size of virtual machines, because there are tons of sizes of virtual machines available in Azure portal, but your organization top management thinks because D2S V2 size is good enough for our organization because it has the required number of cores and the RAM, that should be good enough. You shouldn't be buying the expensive ones. So that can be a policy. You are restricted to only buy certain size of virtual machines, or only a particular admin can make a purchasing decisions. Remember, purchasing, what I'm trying to say is, getting resources from Azure. Of course, we can't purchase, we can only rent resources from Azure. So these can be typical policies. And then there are also initiatives. So what is the difference? So if I can just quickly go to the my portal, and I can show you the, so if I go to the portal and let's say I want to go to the policy. Remember, Azure policy is a service. Azure policy is a service you can use. If you already have policies, you can see on my dashboard, you would have seen what is, the status of those. For example, how much you are in compliance, how much you are like percentage you're not in compliance, and what are the resources which are exempted from this policy. So when you apply a policy, you can always look into this dashboard, and the dashboard tells you whether you are in compliance or you are not in compliance, right? And so if you want to apply policies, you can always go into the getting started, and there are different built-in policies available in Microsoft portal. Chances are you're gonna get a policy available in Microsoft portal, but if you can't find it, what you're looking for, you can always make your own and get a custom policy. And custom policy is like you define your own JSON template for the policy and you upload it. Now, these are all the policy you can see over here, the built-in policies here. And other day I just uploaded this custom policy, so that is what you see custom. But the other than those, the first one, these are all built-in policies, and so these are the examples of the policies. Now here, if I go here, I see two things in here: initiative and policy. Now, if you're wondering what is the difference between an initiative and policy, here is the difference. Policy is just a single statement, and initiative is the collection of different policies which you want to apply together to obtain or to achieve a certain compliance standard. And I give you an example. Just like I said, we only want to buy resources from UK South region. That is an example of policy because it's a single statement, all right? Or we only want to buy certain size of virtual machines. That is the policy because it's a single statement. But initiative is like a collection of policies. For example, ISO 27001, PCI DSS, HIPAA, the healthcare industry use the, these are the examples of the initiative. Because if I look into the ISO 27000 here, ISO 27001 is a collection of a lot of, the security controls. So you can't enforce ISO 27000 by just a single policy. So you can see over here, 50 policies combined. If you see ISO 27001 and in front, this is a 50 number here. So 50 policies you combine, apply simultaneously, then you get ISO 27001. That is initiative. So initiative is nothing but the collection of policies when you're using more than one policy at the same time to achieve some sort of a compliance. That is so these are all initiative, ISO 27001, HIPAA, you can see those healthcare related, PCI, DSS, NIST, these are all examples of policies, PCI, DSS, UK official, and these are. If you go to the policy, then you're going to see the single statements related. So for example, audit virtual machines without disaster recovery configured, apply a tag, and things like this. So these are individual policies, single policies. If you want to see them, what exactly they do, you can see this in the, this is the JSON template. And the JSON template, as I said, it's not a programming language. It's a humanly readable, it's a data exchange format. So you can easily find it, like, key value pair, field type equals, and so it's like always a name value pair you're going to see it. So you can find out, what this does by going through this, what it can do, what it doesn't do. And so you can assign it to your management group, to your subscription, to your resource group, to your resources. It's pretty simple. And so in this way, you will be in compliance. So if I want to assign it, I need to select the scope. And in order to define the scope, you see I got HR also. We created the HR management group earlier. So you can see I can also apply it HR. But if I don't want to apply it at HR, I can also just select, one of the two subscriptions I got, and I can just select it. And in this way, the scope of the policy will be at the subscription level. So it depends on where you want to apply, because if you apply at the management group, it will be inherited to all the resources down it. But if you apply it at the lower level, at the resource group specific, it will only be associated with that particular resource group. So it depends on where you want to apply it, and you just need to so select a scope, and you just need to go ahead and define the exclusions, and and that's pretty much. You can review and you can create, and the policy will be applied. You can also define if you want to exclude some resources from this policy. So for example, there are some resources, virtual machines, which also come under this resource group where you applied this policy, or subscription where you applied this policy. You don't want some of the resources to be under this policy. You can always define exclude them. So you can make a exception that these will be exempted from this, and the policy won't be applicable to this. You can also define remediation. So what about the resources which you already created, and they're not in compliance with the policy? What you're going to do with them? So you can also define, deploy if not exists. That means if the policy is not, then you can do a scan, and then apply those required, and then apply policy also to the existing resources. So you can also do that. So you can look into the different definitions, which policies you have already applied, assignments, and you can also see if you have defined some exemptions. So when you apply those, you're going to see, these listed in those, and this is how you can apply those policies. Now, if I go back into the, so this is how we can, come into the policy. There's one more topic in here, and give me a second, please. So we're back to the our slides. And so we talked about the policy initiative. We now know policy is like a statement, comes from the top management. We want to apply tax to all the resources we create. We want to buy only resources from UK South region. We want to buy certain size of virtual machines. Initiative ISO 27001, the PCI DSS, NIST, whatever the standard you want to be in compliance, you can enforce it, and this is how you can apply those, and it just makes it very simple and easy. The last topic of this is the blueprints. And so blueprint has been in preview since 2.5 years, and that's a very long time for a Microsoft service to be in preview. And I'm not too sure if they want to continue with it, like in a, want to bring it in in a GA, but generally available. But blueprints is also something very useful in the sense that let's say you got a big organizations and you have a different branches, like you have the in UK South region, in East US, in West US, in in South Australia, different branches you got different Azure the VNets and the different Azure deployments in different regions. If you want to maintain a similar environment in all your branches, in all your locations, because it's the same company and you want to have a same environment, then you can come into the blueprints. So blueprint basically depends on 4 things. And you don't need to define all those 4 things, but you can define maximum these 4 things. If you just have 1, 2, 3, 1 maybe not good. Maybe just out of 4 you have 2, 3, or or have all those 4 you can define. They call it artifacts or the elements of the blueprint. And these are JSON templates, resource groups, RBAC, and the policies. So these are the 4 things which come under this. If you have these under the blueprints you can define, then you can import and export your blueprints to your other branches. So they can also have the same blueprint in what it's supposed to mean. So let's take a look at it. So in artifacts, the first thing is the JSON templates. We know what is the JSON templates. JSON templates we use for deployment of resources in Azure. You want to deploy a virtual machine, you want to deploy a database, you want to deploy a site, you want to deploy, whatever the different resources, you can have a JSON template. And so if you use the same JSON template, that means you're going to have the same resource deployed, right? Because the JSON template lists all the configurations and the parameters which you're going to use for the resource, like the location, size of virtual machine, and these other parameters. So first thing is the JSON templates, which is part of this blueprint. And having this same JSON template used, that means you're bringing in consistency in your deployment. The second is the resource group. If you want to have the same resource groups, you can also add it in the in the blueprint as an artifact. The third thing is the permissions, RBAC, role-based access control we talked about. So what are the permissions? Who should have what permissions? So if you want to define those permissions, that can. And the fourth one is the policies you have enforced in your Azure environment. And so policies could be, as I said, buy resources from a specific region, only have the resources from or let's say have your own NIST or whatever initiatives you want to have in place. So let's take a look at it. So if I go to my portal, and let's go to the portal, and I want to go to the blueprint. Azure Blueprint is also a service, and so you can see in Azure Blueprint there are already definitions available, or you can see if you have already assigned the blueprints in here. So let's say I want to create a blueprint, and there are some blueprints available if you want to use the existing one, but let's say I want to use a blank blueprint. All right, so I just want to give a name, and I say, let's say Azure Blueprint, and I want to define the location. This is where I want to keep it. Let's say this one. Then I go next to the artifacts. Now that's important. Now you can see artifacts, the elements I talked about. Here you can see these 4 types I talked about in the slide. And so the first one is, the policy. We already familiar with the policy statement. There are so many built-in policies. So you can add a policy. If you want, which policy is it? You can select the policy from, these built-in policies. Let's say, just pick something. Let's say I want to have this policy. Another artifact is role assignment. What role I want to assign, let's say owner's role, for example. Then I want to go to another artifact, and I want to deploy, let's say, resource group. If I already have, if I have in this subscription, I don't have any, so I can't see in the list. But if I have, then I can always define that. And similarly, you can also define the blueprints you're using for deployment of your resources. So you see, these all 4 things are part of this blueprint. You can define. Once you're done with it, you can keep on adding. Then you can just save draft and you can create it. Then once the blueprint is created, you can export it to your other branches. They will be using the same artifacts-based blueprint. So that means they will have the same templates, they will have the same permissions RBAC, they will have the same policies you're using, and they will have the same resource group you're using. So you will be saying that there's a consistency across your different branch offices in different locations. So this is what very important if you want to maintain the same environment across your different the locations and branch offices. So that is what the the blueprint is. So going back to my slide, and so I think we're almost at the end of the hour, and so yeah, so these are the things which you need to understand in order to govern resources in Azure. So that remember the 4 hierarchy levels and the management group, subscription, resource group, resources, and then the other things like resources, sorry, like the blocks, like the tags, like the RBAC policies, and the blueprints. So these things help you to govern your resources in Azure, and in this way you can have your policies, procedures, and whatever your top management wants, you can enforce it. So with this, I'm pretty much done here. If there are any questions, I'll be very happy to answer that.
Thank you very much, Azhar Saab. It was a very informative discussion around Azure, and I'm looking into the chat window to find any questions. And there are no questions so far. So guys, this is your chance to ask questions if there are any. I have one question related to the Azure blueprints.
Sure.
And my question is that how are Azure blueprints different from Azure policy and ARM templates? Because sometimes I really get very much confused with like how they could be different from Azure policy, or how they are different from an Azure ARM template.
Yeah, sure. That's a very good question. So Azure policy is just one of the element of the blueprint. Azure blueprint is based on 4 artifacts, and that define a blueprint. And so policy is just one of the factor or the element which defines the blueprint. By just having a policy is not good enough for the blueprint to work, because blueprint, well, it's not necessary that you should always have the 4 artifacts in the blueprint, but at least you should have 2, 3 to make it as an environment, because otherwise you can't distinguish between a policy and so policy, as I said, that is just one of the element which you can use, or the artifact of the blueprint. Similarly, ARM template is also one of the factor which you can use in the Azure blueprint. But the difference is that in ARM template, you have a defined template, and so it is always going to be defined unless you make changes to that. So whenever you want to have a particular, let's say, virtual machine of certain size, certain location, certain parameters deploy, you can always use that particular template. And so template is not a policy, it's just a resource you can use for consistency of deployments. For example, you want to deploy 100 virtual machines in your organization, and you want to have the same parameters and configurations for your all the virtual machines you want to deploy. So, if you do the portal and one by one, you will not only take a long time, but it also will, you may make a mistake and you make changes to the configuration. But if you use the template, you deploy it 100 times, 1,000 times, it's always going to be the same virtual machine with the same parameters will be deployed. So ARM templates are pretty good when you want to deploy resources where you want the consistency in the configurations and in the, and the policy, as we know, it's a statement from the top management you want to enforce. Now policy can, you can apply exemptions for the policies. You can't apply exemptions in the ARM template, but in the policy you can say this policy is applied to this subscription, but these resource groups will not be obeying that policy. They will be excluded from that policy. And you can also always make a changes to it. Later on, you think that I want to add this resource group also under this policy, you can do that. So in this way, the policy is different from the ARM template. And as I said, Blueprint is like an environment which includes not only the policy and the template, but also includes the permissions, authorizations, and the resource groups. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah. Sir, I have one more question.
Sure.
These Azure blueprints are still in public preview. They are not. They do not have a GA availability until now. So, what would you suggest? Should these be used in daily work, or we should just rely on on ARM templates only, or on Bicep?
Yeah, so for the time being, you can just use the JSON or the Bicep templates, which is not equivalent to the blueprint, which are just the templates. But I suggest that because something which is in preview, we don't recommend it for use in production environment. If you want to do the testing, or if you want to do some like an experiment or the quality assurance, you can do that. But we don't recommend anything which is in preview to be used in the production environment. And I may be wrong, but I heard that they don't want to bring it into the GA. So we may not see Blueprint, and I don't know the reason behind it. That's, the Microsoft understands this better. But so I think unless you see it in the GA, I suggest you don't go for it in the production. But if you want to just test it, experiment it, that is fine.
Thank you very much, Azhar sir. I am not able to see any question in the chat window, but it was a very informative presentation on Azure, and thank you very much for sharing your slide deck. I will definitely share the slide deck with the participants. And is there anything apart from this that you would like to add?
No, I'm very grateful to you for inviting me, and I'm always going to look forward to do contribution in Azure, Pakistan community, and it's an honor for me. So I really want to thank you for your time and for inviting me, and thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you also very much for your time, and I'm sure that you will also give us your precious time in future.
Sure.
The recording of this presentation would be uploaded to our YouTube channel. And now in the end, I would like to say thank you to everyone, to you, sir, Azhar, and also to all the participants who have participated. So have a very nice day and have a very nice weekend. Okay, bye.
Thank you.